Welcome back, students. Today we're going to be examining some documents regarding the Great Awakening. This is a religious revival movement that is taking place during the 1730s and 1740s, and it's connected to the Revolutionary War. It might seem strange at first glance that a religious movement would be in part related to the American Revolution, but we'll take a look at why that is. Prior to the Great Awakening, we have two forms of Christianity that are primarily being practiced within the colonies. We have Congregationalism, which is descending from the Puritan movement, and we have Anglicanism, which is connected to the old Church of England. We see Christian churches growing as a result of the Great Awakening, including Presbyterianism, Methodism, and Baptism. And the excitement that existed because of key leaders of the Great Awakening draws colonists in and draws people to see these sermons being given by people like George Whitefield by the thousands. George Whitefield developed a reputation of being a phenomenal speaker, an electric speaker. Being at his sermons were like being at a rock concert. Tens of thousands of people would travel great distances to see his sermons. And it's a great example of some of the excitement that existed during the Great Awakening. As we go through the documents for this particular assignment, we're going to be examining some primary source documents, and we're going to be determining why we think George Whitefield was so popular based on the documents. Again, keep this question in mind as we go through the documents. Why was George Whitefield so popular? We'll be examining three primary source documents as we go and consider the question, why was George Whitefield so popular? Again, reminder students, a primary source document is a document that's created by anyone who actually experienced the event and then wrote about it or created something that relates to their experiences. These types of sources are really rich sources for us to examine things because it gives a first-hand perspective that a secondary source simply can't duplicate. So the first thing that we want to look at is our sourcing information. Who created the source? What is the source? So our first source is coming from an autobiography written by Benjamin Franklin in 1793. Ben Franklin was a good friend of George Whitefield, though he did not agree with his religious beliefs. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is recognize the author as Benjamin Franklin. This is an excerpt from his autobiography. It's written in 1793. So these are important things to consider. Now, one of the things that's jumping out at me as I consider the sourcing information is the fact that it's not written until 1793, and we're looking at a religious movement that's occurring during the 1730s and the 1740s. So although Benjamin Franklin was there and he knew George Whitefield, this is written well after the event. So one of the things to keep in mind is if there's a big gap in time between when a source is created versus when a person experienced it, our memories are always going to be most accurate closer to the event, and the greater the elapse of time, the more potential there are for there to be inaccuracies in our memory or maybe not remember certain details. The other thing we want to keep in mind is that George Whitefield, and the sourcing information is telling us, is a friend of Benjamin Franklin. So of course that might make Franklin want to portray George Whitefield in a positive light, but he did not agree with his religious beliefs. So we have a little bit of a mixed bag there in terms of Franklin's relationship and how that might affect the way he portrays George Whitefield. We are going to encounter a few vocabulary terms as we go through the source. Benevolent refers to kind, and oratory refers to speech. All right, let's take a look. Mr. Whitefield went preaching all the way through the colonies to Georgia, where there were many helpless children unprovided for. The sight of their miserable situation inspired the benevolent heart of Mr. Whitefield with the idea of building an orphan house there, in which they might be supported and educated. Returning northward, he preached up this charity and made large collections. I happened to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I realized he intended to finish with a collection, and I silently decided he should not get nothing from me. Franklin thought the orphan house should be built in Philadelphia. I had in my pocket a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pieces in gold. As he proceeded, I began to soften and concluded to give the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that, and I decided to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. He had a loud and clear voice and articulated his words and sentences so perfectly that he might be heard and understood at a great distance, especially as his audiences, however numerous, were completely silent. He preached one evening, and I computed that he might well be heard by more than 30,000. I'd like you to pause the video, and I'd like you to go through this first document, document A. I'd like you to highlight details that might be used to explain why George Whitefield was so popular. So within document A, make some highlights and annotations showing details as to why George Whitefield might have been popular. Go and pause the video. All right, so as we look for details that relate to George Whitefield's popularity, there's a few things that stand out. Number one, in the first paragraph here, it's telling us that he is looking to build an orphan house. So he's interested in helping those who are in need. So I'm going to highlight the portion that relates to the orphan house. So he's in Georgia. Mr. Whitefield, the idea of supporting the orphan house there. So part of me is curious why there's so many orphans in Georgia, which is an interesting thing that we could then research and try to figure out what exactly is going on. But this does strike me as something that would make it more popular. The fact that he's being generous, he's being kind, he's doing something to help the community. These are things that generally would support him being popular in my eyes. It's interesting as we look at the second paragraph, Franklin here is kind of describing the effect that the sermon and the talk that George Whitefield is giving us having on him. And he points out that initially he intended to give none of his money, but as the sermon goes on, he's softened and he's convinced more and more as the talk goes on. And by the end of it, he is wanting to give actually all of his money. So I emptied my pockets wholly. So this really reflects the impact it's having on an audience member, Franklin, who's there. And we know that Franklin is saying that he is opposed to the idea at the beginning. Right? I silently decided in my head he should not get nothing from me, is what Franklin says. So his intention is to give no money, but his mind has changed. This is actually really difficult to do, change people's minds. And he gradually shifts. He decides to give the coppers, and then the silvers, and then everything. So again, this is kind of relating to the fact that it seems like George Whitefield is a really effective speaker. And an effective speaker, I think, would gain more popularity, especially as speaking and writing, these are primary ways of delivering information, especially at the time. And then he goes in here in the last paragraph and hits upon the characteristics that Whitefield is demonstrating as a speaker, that he has a clear voice, that he's articulating his words very well, that he's saying them very clearly, and that the words that he's choosing, he's describing them as so perfectly being delivered. He could be heard and understood for great distances. And it references that there is a large crowd gathering. So again, it seems like he's an amazing speaker based on this description, and I think that that would also contribute to his popularity. We're going to go ahead and work on our first response portion. And what I would like you to do is looking at the document A. It's broken up into 3 parts. So we finish the first part as we read document A. So you're describing the sourcing information, considering the author, what type of document it is when it's created, a sentence here. Summarize the main idea of the document here, and then your first hypothesis here. So according to the document, just document A, why was George Whitefield so popular? And this should be several sentences. So go ahead and work on that first written response portion, pause the video, and when you're done, we'll come back and take a look at document B. All right, let us turn our attention to document B. So we have another primary source document. We have our sourcing information down here at the bottom. Nathan Cole was a farmer from Middletown, Connecticut, who heard George Whitefield preach in 1741. The experience convinced Cole to find salvation and become born again. The excerpt above is from his personal account, which is undated. So we don't actually know when he wrote it, but he's in 1741, he's a witness to George Whitefield and delivering one of his sermons, who's preaching. So the author is Cole. He's seeing it in 1741, and he writes about it. We could also note that the location in which he is living. All right, let's take a look at the document. I was born February 15th, 1711, and born again October 1741. So just the title here really reflects on how powerful his experience was seeing George Whitefield, the fact that he's referencing he's born again when he experiences this event. When I heard that Mr. Whitefield was coming to preach in Middletown, I was in my field at work. I dropped my tool and I ran home to my wife and told her to hurry. My wife and I rode my horse as fast as I thought the horse could bear. When we neared Middletown, I heard a noise like a low, rumbling thunder and soon saw it was the noise of horses' feet. As I came closer, it seemed like a steady stream of horses and their riders, all of a lather and foam with sweat, their breath rolling out of their nostrils with every jump. Every horse seemed to go with all his might to carry his rider to hear news from heaven for the saving of souls. It made me tremble to see the sight, how the world was in a struggle. When we got to the meeting house, there were 3,000 or 4,000 people assembled. I turned and looked back, and the land and banks of the river looked black with people and horses all along the 12 miles. When I saw Mr. Whitefield, he looked almost angelic, a young, slim, slender youth, and hearing how God was with him everywhere put me into a trembling fear. I saw that my righteousness would not save me. All right, let us pause the video here. I'd like you to make some highlights and annotations regarding document B and looking for details that would explain why George Whitefield was so popular. Pause the video and we'll come back in a moment. So there's a few details here that are jumping out at me. In the first paragraph here, it's clear that he's very excited to go and see George Whitefield, that he's pushing his horse as fast as he can bear, that he drops his tools. I dropped my tool and ran home to my wife and told her to hurry. Right, so we know that he's very excited. So this speaks to the effect, again, that George Whitefield's having on people. He references that he's hearing all of these horses like a low rumbling thunder and soon saw it was the noise of horses' feet. So there's a great many horses. So he's reflecting how many travelers that are creating this great noise as they're going to see George Whitefield. The sight of all these travelers has an impact on Nathan Cole as well. He says he's trembling at the idea of the struggle that's going on in the world and the salvation of heaven and saving souls. Then he references how many people. Already there when he arrives, 3,000 or 4,000, so a substantial amount. But then he turns back and he sees miles and miles of more travelers coming. And finally, the entry here closes by focusing on what he notices when he sees Whitefield. And he says he looked almost angelic, like an angel, a young, slim, slender youth. And hearing how God was with him everywhere put me into a trembling fear. I saw that my righteousness would not save me. So this is kind of hitting upon the impact that the talk is having on him. So he's described as a slim, slender youth, angelic. So although it doesn't necessarily explicitly say it, it sounds like he's a good-looking individual, which might also contribute to his popularity, because there is an aesthetic, a physical aesthetic that can contribute to people's popularity, of course. So we have a lot going on in this document. Some similarities as we compare documents A and B. Let us take a look at the second written response portion. So now we'll go through, again, sourcing information, who's the author, what type of document, and when was it created, summarizing the main idea. And now for this second hypothesis, you're factoring in, according to document B. Now there might be some similarity with document A, but first hypothesis focused on doc A. Second one here is going to focus solely on doc B. Go ahead and pause it, finish this response portion, and then we'll look at the final document. Let's take a look at document C. This is by Nathaniel Hinchman. He's a minister in Lynn, Massachusetts. He blamed George Whitefield for breaking up all the New England's churches. The document above is a letter to the newspaper in which he addresses Whitefield. It makes sense that a minister in Lynn would be critical of George Whitefield, because this would be the old established churches that are being challenged by some of the new Great Awakening ideas. So although documents A and B were pretty positive in their description of Whitefield, it seems like this one's probably going to be pretty negative. So that's our author. He's a minister in Lynn, which is important, Massachusetts. And this is a letter to a newspaper. And he's addressing George Whitefield. And we have our date up here, which is 1745. Boston Evening Post, July 15, 1745, to George Whitefield. So although it's a letter addressed to George Whitefield, this is published in the whole newspaper. You have sown the harmful seeds of separation and disorder among us by supporting the new churches, by claiming that our ministers are unacquainted with Christ. You have stopped the spread of the gospel and hurt the peace and good order. You have hurt the very being of our churches. I ask you not to preach in this parish. I do not expect that you will pay attention to what I have written, but I still choose to declare that you are a dangerous man, harmful to the religion of Jesus Christ. Nathaniel Henchman, pastor of the First Church in Lynn. So this one's going to be a little bit more difficult to infer why this made George Whitefield popular, but I think there's a few things we can pull from it. Go and pause the video, highlight some things that are sticking out to you, and think about why this might have contributed to or shown George Whitefield's popularity. All right, let's take a look here. You have sown harmful seeds of separation and disorder among us. So it's highlighting the fact that George Whitefield has had a big impact, at least from the perspective of Nathaniel Henchman. Going so far as to even suggest he's harming the church, harming Christianity. He's asking him not to preach in the parish, in the area, and calls him a dangerous man, harmful to the religion of Jesus Christ. So one of the things that you might consider is that people tend to be drawn to individuals who are rebellious, who are challenging authority. They tend to get people's attention. People tend to want to hear what they're saying. It's exciting. It's dramatic. People oftentimes are drawn into rebellious figures. And this is really the sentiment that's going hand in hand. And it's interesting as we look at the Great Awakening and the fact that some people are challenging the old ways of practicing Christianity, challenging the established churches, the established traditions, and that same desire to challenge the authority and the tradition is going to be present as we look at some of the causes of the American Revolution and what's ultimately going to push the colonies to fight and argue for independence. So as I'm thinking about document C, I'm thinking about the fact that oftentimes people are drawn into a rebellious figure, and it seems like very strongly that George Whitefield is fitting that description based on document C. So we'll do our final response portion here. Again, our sourcing information, summarize the main idea. And now, and at this bottom part, according to document C, why was George Whitefield so popular? All right, so we'll have three different hypotheses, putting it together here, considering why George Whitefield was so popular. I can't wait to see your different ideas. Bye for now.